It's my great joy and honor to bring to our Resilience in Challenging Times series a spiritual teacher whom I just love, Adyashanti. Adya, welcome.
Hi, Tami. It's good to be with you, and especially at this time. It's really nice to be able to connect.
Why do you say especially at this time, Adya?
Well, it's one of the things that I reflected upon at this time. It both has like a very human element and also a spiritual element. It just sort of occurred to me, I think, in a way that was more obvious than before, um, of how everything is about connection, right? So, of course, right now, I think one of the biggest challenges people have is wanting to connect when people are kind of locked down, and of course
Mm-hmm.
they're connecting with the people in their own environment. Maybe they feel over-connected at times, but the sense that we're not connecting in the same, social way as we used to, I think it does get us to reflect upon the importance of human connection, even someone that's a little bit like a hermit, like I am to some extent. It does highlight the sense of how important connection is, to me. Um, and so I've been reflecting upon that. And then it also came to me just kind of reflecting about pretty much, I think, if you think about it, all of spirituality is about connection also, whether we're connecting with our true nature or God or life or our hearts or the essential, or all of our spiritual practices, I think, in one way or another, are their attempts to connect with something deep, meaningful, essential. So I think in like lots of different sort of realms and dimensions all at once, that I think this time is really highlighting, at least for me, the how pervasive the importance of connection is for any human being.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm with you, Adya, and I'm grateful for this chance to connect with you and for you to connect with our audience. I want to take a moment, though, because as you're talking, what's coming up for me is a pain that I feel for the people out there who are sheltering by themselves and who are having the experience of like, yeah, connecting on the internet through Zoom, through the web. It's not really doing it for me. And I hear how the essence of spirituality is connection. But truth be told, I feel a bit isolated during this time, and it's really hard. What would you say to that person?
Well, first of all, I think I would say yes. When you don't feel uh, connected, like, yeah, you can feel lonely, you can feel alone, you can feel apart. Like, these are really natural emotions for any of us, and especially if you're in kind of a lockdown in your home or your apartment or your condo and you're alone, you're experiencing that in a different way than those of us who have someone we're living with, or even have a pet, that we can reach out and touch and talk to, or whatever. Um, and so I think, to me, the first thing that comes up is, first of all, just kind of an affirmation, like, yeah, that's really human to feel that way. And that doesn't make it go away to say that, but but it's kind of, I think, sometimes just the sense that like our feelings or our emotions are are really okay, they're really natural, can be helpful, because especially when we feel disconnected in some way, our minds can go into this place where we start to kind of doubt ourselves, or wonder if there's something wrong, or lots of different kind of interpretations. But also on another level, I think one of the opportunities, and I know by saying opportunity, I don't mean to paint it as, overly simplistic, but I think one of the opportunities is there is different kinds of connection, and connecting with something really deep in ourselves is is the opportunity, I think, here, is the opportunity when we can just sort of acknowledge that we might feel alone or lonely from that human connection. That doesn't mean that you're just, that's it. Like you're kind of stuck with loneliness or feeling cut off or disconnected, that there are other kinds of connection, um, that sometimes being alone actually really fosters other kinds of connection. That's why people have gone to retreats, or if sometimes those retreats are alone, or what yogis have gone to caves or been alone. But the aloneness was always as a helpful means to a deeper interconnection. So I think, if when you can't have that human connection, I think it's a time to kind of acknowledge that that's really important, and acknowledge that there are different types of connection that might really be helpful. That might
Now,
really, really be helpful.
Adya, when I introduced you, I said how much I love uh, being with you and learning from you. And a big part of that is I think of you as a real heart based teacher. And one of the things you teach on is awakening at the level of the heart. And I wanted to talk about that in the context of this pandemic. One of the experiences I've had is that in my own life, and even in the life of Sounds True, we're relatively insulated from a lot of the pain that people are experiencing, economic pain, and a lot of the pain of various health crises and other kinds of things like that. And there's a way that, our hearts aren't separate, though, from the pain that's happening in the world, even
Mm-hmm.
though it's not right in my personal experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you can talk to our listeners some on how we can relate to pain that's not personal,
Mm-hmm.
and even saying, oh, this isn't even mine, but it still hurts, and
Yeah.
how you see that, how you view that.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, Tammy, because I can feel that. I can feel that. I can feel that kind of that kind of pain, as you're using the word, in the collective. That it's there. I can feel the kind of anxiety. I can feel the kind of fear. Um, and you're right. There, like, as we were just talking before the program. There are people that are are in a situation, in a life situation, that this is easier for them than other people. Some people, this is really, really challenging. Um, Whether it's them alone, or the fears of job loss or income, or paying the rent, or keeping the kids educated. There's lots of, I think, challenges that people meet. And whenever I think when we, as human beings, when we're met with challenge, like personal challenge or collective challenge, and this is both, right? We're experiencing this, like you said, there's a collective dimension, a sort of transpersonal dimension of, and also, but that is also experienced in a very individual and unique way. And I think when we feel this kind of challenge, emotional challenge, let's say, um, I think it's useful to recognize that there's often sort of a very human sort of defensive um, thing that happens, when we feel alone or depressed or anxious or afraid. There's something in us emotionally, and you can even feel it in your body, that kind of pulls back a bit, right? It kind of pulls back, pulls in. It's kind of like, ouch. Even when you say ouch, we never say like ouch. It's always ouch. It's always it's a sort of a contraction, but that's natural, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's like we just do that biologically as well as psychologically. Um, but I think that's important to notice, because that needs to be um, worked with, right? We can go that ouch, but then I think the question is, how do we respond to that? What's our response to when we feel any kind of pulling back, contraction for whatever reason? Either we kind of get, when something just seems kind of a little kind of big, it's like a tidal wave and it just sort of takes you. Or we can sort of realize, or even just experiment with what it might be like to kind of really lean into it, like an emotional embracing of these challenging experiences. Again, there's the personal dimension of that, and then there's like just what's happening all around us and what the state people are in, and even just the objective situation that at least human beings find themselves in, and all this. And um, I think it's really important to recognize that there can be that sort of instinctual pullback, but also we can also, by being conscious of that, we can ask ourselves, like, what would it mean to lean into that?
Can you be very specific? Like, I'll give you an example. So somebody wakes up 3 in the morning. They don't even
Yeah,
know why. They don't even know why they woke up.
yeah.
And it's nothing even, let's just pretend here in my example, my hypothetical, but very real and grounded example, that just so happens to be true in my life. How did you know? Anyway, wake up 3 in the morning. You don't even know why, but suddenly there's this upset. There's this
Mm-hmm.
strange kind of fluttery feeling. Things aren't quite right, but it's not even specific. There's not even a story to it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you lean in, to use your language, in
Okay, it's a
when
great
that experience?
question. Yeah, it's a great question. Um, so this is the first thing, because I think I want people to be able to connect with what I'm saying sort of instinctually, right? So it's not just a sort of mechanical, here's how to do it kind of thing. Um, I think the first thing is, as this might seem odd because it might seem separating, but it's not really separating, is I think you kind of think of it as, sometimes I think of it as otherizing your feeling. So you wake up in the middle of the night and you just have some, things don't, just doesn't feel right, or you're upset or whatever. You don't know why. Maybe it doesn't have a storyline or a narrative that you're conscious of, right? And by otherizing, I mean, what would you do if your best friend came to you with that feeling? How would you meet them? Like, what instinct, what would your first inclination, if someone you really deeply cared about, whether it's a friend or a lover or your child or something you cared about, came to you with that feeling, right? And said, hey, this is how I'm feeling. I think most people, even before we think like, okay, this is what I would say or do, but before that, there's something in us that would, first of all, we'd lean in, like almost with our, not only our mind, but our heart, right? We'd be, we'd lean towards them. We'd lean in like we do, right? When
Mm-hmm.
someone's sharing something with you, and if you watch them, we literally will lean in, right? We'll sometimes lean in across a table to get close, to make connection. And what I've seen is, if you kind of imagine for a moment that this, your emotion belonged to someone you love, it evokes kind of these very natural kind of caring, heartful instincts, right? The party that leans in, that's not just like, how do I get rid of this? What do I do about it? And you're trying to analytically figure it out. The first thing is there sort of an intimate, like uh, an intimate engagement. Just that split second when someone you love tells them about a difficulty, something in your heart leans in. It's interested. And I think that feeling, that's the first thing that I would want to try to evoke in someone. Because unless we get that feeling of caring, everything else then tends to become mechanical. We're doing this, we're doing that, we're doing some strategy. But I think it's important to connect with the caring. And I think the paradox is that as soon as you think, well, what would I do if the person I love most came to me with this feeling? It evokes some very caring, compassionate response. But when it's you, and it's just you, as you said, in your room, in the middle of the night, it's funny, it often doesn't evoke those caring, compassionate attitudes, does it? It evokes something else. We kind of get we get a little lost in the feeling and in the emotion. And so that's the first thing that I would do is just, what would you do if someone, your lover came into the room at 3 o'clock in the morning and said, hey, I'm feeling upset and this is what I feel, you know?
Sure.
I think most people would, you know, they may articulate it differently, but probably they'd be like, you're gonna sit down, tell me about it. And they would be, I hope they would be open, essentially open and caring about what that person was feeling. And what I found is when we can evoke that feeling of caring inside of ourselves for our own emotional life, that's that's so much of the healing. So much of the healing just comes from evoking a sense of caring for your own feeling, for your own experience.
Okay, so I love that, Adya, and I think it's a great start. I'm tempted to ask, like, is that 50%, 90%? What's the rest of it that I need? I get it, the befriending, and I
Yeah.
get how big it is. I
Yeah.
really do. It's a
Okay.
big, different kind of turning,
Right.
and it's a turning towards instead of a pushing away. And, I get it. It's big.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Okay. And then the next thing. Okay. So I know I said it and you said it, but I'm still going to reiterate one last time that that's the most important step, right? Without that, anything else we do is going to be, there's not going to be the caring. So just that's essential. I think then right there, as soon as you evoke some amount of the caring heart, already you have more space. You have more space, and not just more space inside emotional space, but also a willingness, like to just to really allow that experience to be. And I mean, really allow it to be almost as something very, very physical. So I would draw someone's attention just towards the the actual experience, what they're feeling. Where in the body do you feel it? Is it in your tummy? Is it in your heart? Right? Is it in your left shoulder? Is it anytime I've ever asked somebody, where is that feeling? Where is it in your body? People have always been able to tell me where it is predominantly. If we don't ask the question, it just feels like it's all over. But again, so that helps us to narrow down our attention a little bit, right? So we're really with that feeling, right? Feelings are kind of like, I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify this, Tami, but because I'm speaking in certain amount of generalities, but our emotional life, our life of feeling, I think the question that we often have is, or the difficulty is feelings that just seem to get stuck, right?
yeah,
Like to wake up at 3 in the morning with a weird or uncomfortable feeling isn't that big a deal if it's gone in 5 minutes. But if it's there 2 hours later, all of a sudden this starts to feel like a pretty big deal. And what I have seen is that an emotion that we're kind of in some amount of either resistance to or overly analyzing it, it doesn't allow our body to do what our bodies do. Right? Our bodies, not just, I mean, when I say our bodies, body, mind, psychology, it's all sort of one process. And our bodies and minds and psychology do a pretty good job of purifying themselves if they're allowed to do so. So the question is, how do we allow that process? How do we join with the process rather than resist the process? And I think the first thing we do, meet it with compassion, right? A sense of caring, that's probably more accurate. And then allow that feeling state to unfold itself. Literally just be willing to experience it and be willing to experience it. And your mind will tend to take you off track of doing that, right? As soon you try to experience something, and before you know it, very quickly there'll be this association and that association and this thought, and then it'll evoke some fear of the future, or so our minds start dancing around when we hit difficulty. And that dancing around of our minds can be approached with caring too. It's like, yeah, okay, there's our mind dancing around, scaring itself or depressing itself or whatever it does with its thoughts and ideas and images. But again, that can be kind of like encouraged to come back to what we're actually experiencing. Because what we're actually experiencing, uh, when we're just with the experience of it, then our bodies and our minds and our psychology are surprisingly adept at reestablishing a kind of flow.
Mm.
I mean, you see this, say, for instance, with, I think the most obvious example of this is often with grief. You know, you experience grief, and anybody who's gone through real grief, loved one, sometimes losing a pet, various kinds of grief, it's not like you can wave a wand and make the grief go away. It's not even that that's the right thing to do, right? Grief, say, is a totally appropriate response to loss. But I certainly found this. I've talked to lots of people who, lost really important people in their lives and gone through a grieving process. And part of that, at some point in that process, especially when it starts to feel healing, right, is when they just kind of they just let themselves grieve. They just okay. They just let the process be the process, right? And then it starts to, instead of being one continuous, everlasting sort of tsunami, it comes in waves. It'll come and then it kind of goes out and then it comes back and then it goes out. But with time, the body and the mind sort of is purifying itself, right? But it needs to be allowed to have the experience to do that.
Mhm.
Our minds are very often trying not to have the experience, right? But that gets in the way of the natural process. We have to let ourselves experience what we experience in order for it to move through us.
Now, Adya, you've obviously been teaching on emotions and how to work with difficult emotions, probably since the day you opened your mouth as a spiritual teacher.
Probably so, yeah.
Probably, I mean, since that's so much of what
Mm-hmm.
people bring to the
And I've
journey
had a lot of practice with
challenge.
it in my life too. Right?
You're referring,
I haven't just been
yeah,
teaching it. I've practiced it a lot in my life, as we all do.
yeah.
Yeah.
And what I'm curious about is here right now in the midst of the COVID-19 global pandemic, do you see that
Yeah.
there's some kind of special opportunity now that people are being more confronted with difficult emotions than perhaps they were at other times? Or how do you see it?
I think we're obviously people are feeling more confronted with difficult feelings. It's different for different people. Like, because I get a lot of emails, I'm sure you get a lot of feedback. I get
Mm-hmm.
lots of feedback from people because I'm still teaching in this. And it can range anywhere from, like you said, someone feeling really lonely to anxiety, what's going to happen, to outrage, why aren't we dealing with this in a better way, to, a whole range of challenging emotions. And so, yeah, I think people are definitely confronted with 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 this kind of challenge, right? Because it's it's not the norm for us, right? It disturbs everything that we think that is normal, that we know, that we depend on. All of that gets thrown up in the air. I do think, Tami, that um, I do think from time to time it's really important that we really take moments to really consider and realize that not all of it, but certain ways of emotionally responding, that we really should look and ask, like, what do I really want to contribute here, right? So we can say, in other words, you can like watch the news and get yourself terribly worked up and upset about the way something's being handled or not handled, or whatever your point of view might be. And of course, I think we should all be informed about the world around us. But at the end of the day, the important thing, I think, I think of it as a kind of responsibility, that we really look at, like, okay, what do I want to contribute in this situation? What do I really want to, even just emotionally, even if we're not going outside and being able to contribute in lots of ways, some people are and can do that, but also emotionally, what do I want my contribution to be? Do I just want to contribute being upset? Do I just want my contribution to be, endless worry about the future? What do I want my contribution to be? And I don't mean to suggest that you can just then choose any feeling you want. But I do think it's in a really important time um, because there's great challenges and it's not just isolation. That's one of the great challenges. But our whole culture is facing immense challenges, right? And I think when you're in that situation, I think it really behooves us to at times step back and really, really honestly assess, what do I want to be contributing here, right? What do I want to be contributing? What do I want um, my response to this to be? So that's one of the things that I look at. I know it's not the lens that I would look at it all the time, but I do think there's something about assuming a kind of responsibility that sometimes evokes something really good in us.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, yeah, this is a
Yeah.
challenging moment, and man, it's calling me and each of us to step to the plate.
Mm-hmm.
And what do I want that to be? The
Mm-hmm.
next time I get on the phone with my friend, and the next thing I talk about, what are we creating together? And is that what I want to be creating together? That
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I think when we kind of sort of step up and realize that we are contributors, and this is a really important time, that sometimes it can evoke the better part of our nature.
I love that, Adya. I think that's very helpful and very clear. Now, this particular series is called Resilience in Challenging Times. And when I was thinking about you and the word resilience, I was thinking about, for whatever reason, how you're very athletic and your bicycle riding, and how you used to compete,
Mm-hmm.
bicycle, this and that.
Yeah.
And resilience is a word that means something in particular to athletes, I
Yeah.
think. You fall off the bike, you get back on the bike, you finish the race. uh, how do you think of athletic resilience and how that does or doesn't relate to the challenge of being resilient in the time that we're in as contributors and spiritual practitioners?
That's a really interesting question, actually, because I do think that, especially, I'm not anymore, but for so many years being a competitive athlete, there were some things that were really useful. And I think one of the things that I learned that was the most useful, when you're an athlete, you can't just sit around and thinking about being good. You got to go out there and train, right? Almost like in spirituality, where we talk about practice. Practice is a kind of training. And I think when I bring that over, not only into the spiritual domain, at least the better parts of it, right? There are parts of it that don't belong, obviously, but also emotionally. And I think that it's important that we realize that emotional resiliency is like a muscle, in a sense, and it can be trained. And it's a really important thing to train, because none of us is going to get out of life without experiencing, tragedy of varying kinds. That's part of life. Big tragedy, small tragedy, difficulty, whether you're awakened or not. You're going to be challenged in life. And I think that realizing that we can build emotional resiliency. And I think part of emotional resiliency, recognizing how important it is in life, right? Um, is I think it's a really important part of spiritual practice, actually. And what we were just talking about, like I sometimes I think when I'm saying things like I was 10 minutes ago. We're talking about waking up at night and meeting things. And I'm sure for some people, there's people probably listening like, well, yeah, I get that. And it's a really great idea. But, last night I woke up and I woke up in a tsunami of emotion. I was just floored until, for whatever reason, it cleared up a little bit, and sometimes say, well, some of the suggestions that I would give are like, sometimes like, wow, that's like a lifeline that it's hard for me to find in the storm, you know? And yeah, I get that. And sometimes, admittedly, it is. And I think it behooves all of us to work towards that emotional resiliency, like whether we're challenged or not. And I think a big part of emotional resiliency is building the capacity for experience. It's like building a vessel, you know? Sometimes we feel like the vessel's really small. And so when we have an emotion, it just feels like, oh, it's just gonna, when you just feel like it's just too much and you're being stretched beyond your capacity. And then sometimes, strangely, you can have some strong challenge in life or emotion. And sometimes it can even surprise you like, wow, this is challenging, but there seems to be space for it, right? Because your vessel, for whatever reason, is wide. And so I think that attending to that emotional life, like allow really, really being very mindful of all manner of human experience, but the willingness to really directly be with it. That builds the vessel. It creates more resiliency. You literally exercise that muscle that's like, yeah, I can now experience emotional challenge that I couldn't really do well with last week or last month. In that sense, there's a certain element it's like a muscle, right? It's the more you work it, the stronger it gets, the more resilience you get emotionally. And so, like what we were talking about, I see it as not just like, here's how to manage your way through a challenging time, but I look at it as, here's an approach to life experience all the time. All the time. From the little frustrations to the big ones, to the little fears to the big ones, for the little disappointments to the big ones. When we start to create that capacity to really experience what we're experiencing. But here's the key, and then I'll let you move on. I think one of the real keys to all this is that it's voluntary. It's voluntary. Voluntary means when we make the choice to do it. Okay, I will do this. I'm voluntarily making the choice to experience what I'm experiencing. Because if we don't make that voluntary choice, then it's just, wow, I'm bowled over by some big experience and I don't want to be experiencing. I am not voluntarily experiencing this thing. But it's just a kind of a misunderstanding of almost like the physics of emotion, that what we voluntarily decide that we're willing to experience, that decision right there opens up capacity. And so that's kind of part of what I'm talking about, is that part that goes, yes, I'm voluntarily willing to experience what I experience.
Okay, now I'm just going to actually drill down a little bit more, Adya, because in making this comparison to, if I asked you, how did you train to be, a world-class bicyclist? You would tell me exactly what you did, how you voluntarily went out, the exercises you did, whatever, the 10, 20 miles, obviously I don't know that much about biking, but the big hill you went up, etc. You would tell me your exact training protocol. Yeah. And here, as I've been talking about building emotional capacity, as you've been describing that in response to my questions, you've said, well, this is not just something I teach on. This is something, Tami, I myself have gone through. I've done it. I did. So tell me your training path when it comes to emotional capacity? What did you have to do? Because, I think there's some idea people look at
Yeah.
Adyashanti and he somehow, he miraculously became one of these awakened ones. Did he go through some kind of emotional training thing, or, what happened?
I sure did, man, in a big way. Yeah, I mean, the real answer to that question is varied, right? It's a big, big,
Sure.
big thing. I want to try to make it something that's relevant to now, though, But of course, it's a really, really big issue. But I think for me, it started actually with when I started to meditate. And, you experience all sorts of things you don't want to experience, you know, whatever it is, boredom, anxiety, fear, whatever, and you never know what you're going to get on a particular day. And one of the things I learned along the way, Tami, that was really useful is generally what we're encouraged to do in meditation is kind of just watch our emotions, right? You often get the image of, watch whatever you're experiencing and imagine you're on the bank of a river and it's just the river flowing by, all that kind of stuff. And okay, that has a certain relative usage, but I found that didn't cut it when it came to the big stuff, that I needed something else. And what I started to see was, no, actually, what I didn't need to be trying to be metaphorically up on the riverbank watching all my experience pass. Where I needed to be meditating was in the middle of the river of my experience, was to widen my capacity, widen my yes. So I'm bored. Yes. Okay, I'll be bored. I won't try to distance myself. I won't try to watch it from the outside. I'll watch it from the inside. And what I noticed was it was just this little shift. It started with meditation, but of course, for me, these things continued beyond meditation, right? If it's good for the cushion, it's good for the rest of your life, all the other points of your life too, if it's really relevant. For me, what started to work much better was to, like I said, I would like to sit right in the middle of and stretch my capacity to allow myself to have that experience. And what I found, that created a different kind of invulnerability, an invulnerability where I didn't need to be apart from my experience in any way, but I grew my capacity to have my experience. And so that's where it sort of started for me. And then I think, as most of us find in life, there's lots of my life that's been quite fortunate and lucky and everything. And as you well know, I went through basically a 15-year period of experiencing pain levels that I didn't even think were imaginable, before that, for very, very long
Physical
periods.
pain.
Physical. And of course, physical pain doesn't stay physical, does it? Right?
Mm-hmm.
It starts physical, but there's a relationship with that pain too. So physical pain can, that quickly can become emotional. These things can never be divided out like really nicely. And that was my sort of, I think of it as now sort of my brutal laboratory of stretching that capacity, experiencing things that my goal sometimes was, can I take this for 30 more minutes? Because an hour is not even conceivable, much less a day. And yet that would go on sometimes for months, but I'd have to take it in 30-minute increments at times. And I was extremely challenged. I don't want to pretend that at times I wasn't, it was almost overwhelming, but boy, did it stretch the capacity. Because, when something gets challenging enough, you can't stay on the outside of it. You just can't do it.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't, all the spiritual tricks break down when things get intense enough. And the thing that I found helpful was the thing that I had bumped into so many years ago, which was, okay, this is about stretching the capacity for right inside of the experience. And the way that I'd always seen to do that would be to join with my experience to whatever extent I could, to say, yes, instead
Hmm.
of no.
What's
Yes doesn't
interesting.
mean I like it. I
Sure.
can not like it and still say yes.
What's interesting, Adya, is you're pointing out about how some of the most intensive training experiences were involuntary.
Hmm.
And yet you emphasized how important it is that we voluntarily choose
Yeah.
to make this move towards our difficult experience. I think that's an interesting kind of paradox of our conversation. Why did you
Hmm.
emphasize the importance of making this conscious choice when we have the option to make the choice?
Yeah. Um, honestly,
Yeah.
very pragmatically, because it was the only thing that worked. It's the thing that worked to kind of say no and to not, like I said, what I realized is voluntarily confronting anything changes our whole relationship with it. And involuntarily just taking something, like, oh, this is happening. And, all of your sort of conditioning goes, no, I don't want to be experiencing this. How do I get out of it? I want to escape. It's like that tends to just take us further in.
Right.
We're just, like I said, in one sense, it's sort of practical that it just doesn't work to be endlessly trying to escape, right?
Hmm.
But it works to build capacity, and we can build capacity by voluntarily um, opening ourselves to our experience.
Right.
And
Okay.
that's why I emphasize it, because the
Yeah.
voluntary part is, to me, it's the key to everything emotionally. That's the key.
Okay, Ajay, I have just one final question for you. As we were getting set up for this conversation, our engineer, who's been with me on many of these different resilience and challenging times, said, so, not in so many words, but this was the gist. So, I'm sure you're going to talk about fear and pain and grief and loss, but maybe you could talk about the opportunity in this time,
Mm-hmm.
Tami. I want to hear what Adya has to say about the special opportunity that we have right now in this moment in history during the pandemic. So I'm curious how you respond to that.
I think it's an immense opportunity. Honestly, it's also an immense challenge. So many opportunities are. I think that the opportunity is that reflection of, like, when you're in a forced pause, or any pause, but we're kind of in a forced pause, let's say, it's an opportunity to really realign, like, what's really, really important. What am I orienting my life around? What am I, because we are all orienting our life around certain principles. Generally, people are totally or mostly unconscious of the principles their whole life is ordered around, because they're kind of conditioned, right? In that sense, they're involuntary, they're kind of automatic. But I think whenever we get these kind of pause, and we're confronted with not just the pause of not being able to go anywhere, but the confrontation with great human challenges, right? That is a kind of opportunity, and an opportunity that I would suggest is also goes right into a necessity to become conscious of of what we're orienting our life around, moment to moment to moment. In other words, what's super, what's really important, and what am I orienting my life around?
Mhm.
What orients my life from day to day, or my next conversation, or my next, you know, my relationship, my spirituality, my life, my relationship with my kids, my relationship with my emotions in the middle of the night. Like, what is the thing that's really, really, really important to me? Spirituality, if it's anything, it is it is it is realizing what's really, really important to you. And the way I help people kind of define what's really, really important to you is what is so important that you're willing to suffer for it. That kind of helps clarify it. So let's say, for instance, uh, when Martin Luther King wanted to talk about civil rights, right? He obviously oriented his whole life around that principle, about that heartfelt, um, heartfelt principle. And it wasn't easy, right? It was challenging. He was willing to suffer for it, because sometimes when we think of this, what helps clarify it is, like I said, he was willing to be challenged by it. So what's important? Because we can all come up with, well, this is important, or that's important, or this is important. Yeah, but is it important enough for you to suffer for? I'm not saying that means you will suffer for it,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm saying it helps get clear on what's really important. You know what I mean? What's really at stake. And I think that this is something we all need to do, because, we seem to be swimming in an environment in which this kind of question isn't really being asked that often and that deeply. And I'm not talking about what sort of ideologies we might hold that are important. I went something deeper than that. It's almost something more like a principle. So I think we've talked about this before. For me, those two principles are truth and love. Those are pretty big aims. Those are aims that, like,
Can't go wrong, Adya. Can't go wrong with truth
you
and love.
always, yeah, but you can't go wrong with them in a certain sense. But they're also great because you can never get to the point where you go, I've achieved it. Right? I've got all the truth and I embody all the love. Right? That's not like it's something that life is aimed at. And those sound like big, far off principles, but what I've realized is where they become real is like, okay, I'm having a conversation with Tami right now, right? And she's asking me certain questions. And my orienting value is, okay, I'm going to be as truthful with Tami as I can possibly be, no matter what. I'm going to be as truthful and honest as I can possibly be. And since we're doing this to hopefully be of some benefit to people, right? I'm going to commit to this being, to me, speaking and articulating what's most truthful as far as I can know and experience it, and also what's most helpful. Now, that does away with a lot of nonsense that doesn't fall into those categories, right? And so it's really a sort of a practical, truth isn't just big abstract ideas of truth. It's just sincerity, honesty, authenticity, integrity. These come down to these very human sort of qualities. So anyway, I think if we really reflect and we not let our conditioning, our culture, the sense of morality we might have been taught to define what's important, that they really look a little deeper than that, something that's sort of innate, right? We're not doing it to be a good person or be noticed it's something because it feels like this is the thing that if I violate it, if I don't live this out, I'll be violating something in me. I'll be violating my soul in a certain sense. And yeah, that's a search for most any of us to really find what that is that's that important. But I think that when we do, our life has orientation. And what I found when we really get to that soulful level, it's always includes everyone. Because what feels soulfully aligned is never just about me. Right? It's about us. I like truth and love are important to me, not just because of their like personal things for me, but they're means by which I can orient towards having the best contribution for others. Those are the things that help me do that. So those may sound, sometimes this stuff sounds, like big in a certain sense. But I think actually for each of us, that our lives can and properly are oriented around something really big, important, but it's important that we humanize that big principle so that that big principle trickles down into, like I said, what is the value that I'm orienting now when I'm talking to you right now? That that's trickled down. It's no longer a high philosophical principle. It's a moment to moment life, orientation. And I think that, when we have all these great challenges, I I have concluded quite long ago that we live in sort of what I call a soul illiterate culture. We don't have the language for it anymore. It's not talked about very much anymore. Um, and so we're kind of illiterate, but we can find that language, I think, and find inside of ourselves by beginning to contemplate, yeah, what's so important that it's worth orienting my life around. That's, I think, by definition would be something pretty darn important.
Mhm.
And and I think this is a time, like, we're confronted with ourselves. We can, that's a time like, am I really gonna look inside? And by the way, what we'll find also, which will be disappointing in this process, is when we look at this, we will be confronted with, oh, I didn't know I was actually orienting around that idea, which may not, you know, may be kind of humbling. Oh, I was actually I've actually been orienting my life towards something that's not particularly soulful. But that's okay. Like, we need to discover that, right? We actually want to discover the things that aren't working for us particularly well, because then we can uncover the deeper thing. So that's how I see that we can relate to this as another opportunity to, you know, to be connected in this really, really deep, soulful, life orienting way.
Adya, you bring so much soul to Sounds True and to our efforts and everything we're up to. So I just want to bow and thank you. Thank you for being part of really the inspiration for me personally and such an important voice at Sounds True. Thank you so much.
Well, that's very sweet of you to say. Yeah,
It's true.
I appreciate that a lot. Yeah.
Thanks everyone for being with us. SoundsTrue.com, waking up the world.